Hello to Grover Norquist. He's the founder and president of Americans for Tax Reform. Grover, we are grateful that you're Skyping in this morning on America's Forum.
Good to be with you.
Thanks, Grover. Now, first of all, to what Elizabeth Warren has to say, strip away the anti-Republican, anti-House comments. Is there a grain of truth in the problem with the proposal dealing with derivatives?
We've spent a lot of time in the last several years focusing on Obamacare and how it puts government control over all of our health care. Dodd-Frank is almost as big as Obamacare. We just don't see it because it's the government trying to be a banker and an investment banker and running a hedge fund. We are trying to remove some of the most onerous and destructive parts of Dodd-Frank. This was actually a Democrat proposal because people who live in New York know how damaging and expensive Dodd-Frank can be to that industry. We need to look at Dodd-Frank in the same way that we look at Obamacare and take out the parts that are clearly destructive and replace both of those bills. So Warren is right. This is the beginning of deconstructing a very bad, very destructive Obamacare for your bank.
And in this case, it may be a unique situation where the left and right agree, at least on the fine print of derivatives. You know, Grover, the old joke is omnibus should be called ominous because so many provisions are added, stuck on at this time of year like a Christmas tree, but rather than being a gift that keeps on giving, there are some problems with it. Now, leadership has a different point of view. Tom Cole, the Oklahoma Republican, very close to Speaker Boehner, has a differing view with what Elizabeth Warren had to say. Let's take a listen to Tom Cole.
This bill gets a lot of good things done for the American people. It also preserves, the opportunity to do some more going forward. This pension deal is a huge, huge victory for the American people, the American taxpayer.
So we hear Tom Cole. What is good about this bill, Grover? We got about 2 minutes left in this segment.
Okay, there's one big good thing, and it's the most important one. It preserves the sequester, the spending limit. It keeps to the caps. It keeps to the spending limits. Everything under that, there's some little good things and there's some little bad things, but the big victory is keeping the sequester and keeping spending going down as a percentage of GDP on all domestic discretionary spending. Big, big win. Second, there's a bunch of stuff. We cut budgets of the IRS. There was some pension reform that will actually save the government because fewer pensions will go bankrupt. That's important. Remember, the Democrats haven't allowed any bills to pass for the last 2 years. So there are a lot of things here that have bipartisan support, like the pension reform, that are actually crammed into an omnibus that in normal times, if Reid wanted to tell everybody the Republicans won't agree to anything. So what did he do? He didn't allow the Democrats to agree to anything, and he said the Republicans were causing gridlock. Reid's power is waning. That gridlock is reduced. A lot of these things are in the omnibus, or if they didn't get in the omnibus, we'll vote on them one at a time in the next 2 years. This is progress. Does this solve all the world's problems? No. The Democrats had to agree to it. Obama had to agree to it. We still, for the next 2 years, have to live with Obama's veto. We're going to have a lot of small victories, and we need to make sure we don't have any big losses.
And of course, the perception from a lot of grassroots conservative activists is that there are some mighty big problems with the bill. Tell you what, Grover, we're going to step aside, but you've graciously consented to stay with us. When we come back, let's talk more about this bill and about the details on what many of us regard as amnesty, the border, the future, the spending, and a possible vote today on Capitol Hill on this $1 trillion-plus spending bill. More with Grover Norquist as America's Forum continues. Let's continue the conversation with Grover Norquist, the founder and president of Americans for Tax Reform. Now, Grover, this may really presage the division that will go on through 2016 between and among Republicans about what's happening with immigration. Jeff Sessions over in the Senate and a lot of conservatives in the House are saying to John Boehner and Hal Rogers, chairman of Appropriations, we can attach directions on how the money is spent. Remember, Hal Rogers said that because some of these citizenship services are funded by fees, essentially Congress's hands are tied. The Congressional Research Service says that is not the case. Jeff Sessions, other conservatives want explicit instructions forbidding the president from spending any of this money for changes in immigration. Why don't Speaker Boehner and Chairman Rogers listen to them and include that kind of language in this bill?
Well, this bill, if you'd included it, it would have been vetoed, and all of the important other things that were in the bill wouldn't have happened, and we'd have spent the next 3 months of next year arguing about the budget rather than moving on a whole series of issues as well. What they did was they took out Homeland Security and said that they will attach a rider along those lines to the Homeland Security bill. If the president wants to veto that, then he would simply be defunding Homeland Security. We wouldn't have a government shutdown. The idea, the president was going to veto that if you'd put it in, so you weren't going to get it. It's imaginary to think, we'll make the president sign it. Really? How? We went through this before with the effort a year ago, which cost us the Republican governorship of Virginia, because instead of discussing the evils of Obamacare, we were discussing the shutdown. When you have a shutdown, you don't talk about the topic A that you think you're talking about. The press only talks about the shutdown. So let's isolate the president's unilateral action, executive orders on immigration, and focus on that. But also, as soon as we get into next year, there are half a dozen issues where there's broad support in the Republican Party and even many Democrats on immigration reform. We should dramatically increase H-1B visas. That's a consensus issue in the public. It's a consensus issue in the House and Senate. And I don't think the president dares to veto that because the high-tech community would be awfully unhappy. We have real problems in the farm industry. We need a guest worker program for farmers. Does the president really want to veto a measure which would solve problems for farmers? We should get a path to citizenship for people who served in the military, something that Republicans had put forward, but the Democrats in the Senate didn't want to move on. So there are a whole series of STEM people who come over and get PhDs in high-tech industry, engineering and science. Those people should be invited to stay and work here rather than go back to India and create businesses to compete with us.
You know, Grover, with all due respect, the H-1B visa argument in 2006 with full employment probably carried some weight. But we still have economic problems, and the world has changed in those years, and I appreciate you outlining what you believe will be a constructive action, but obviously there is significant disagreement with what you're outlining. A lot of folks, a lot of grassroots folks would suggest that is amnesty. But apart from that, let me go back.
Wait. Changing the law that in the future you can have a guest worker program? How in the hell is that amnesty?
Well, I will tell you what, when you use the language, my good friend, a path to citizenship, even the way this administration wants to exploit the military and put gaping loopholes in for that type of thing, you have this fundamental problem. With Mr. Obama in the White House, you know, A, he will not either not enforce, or B, he will enforce in his own image any efforts to deal with the border. A minute remains. You get the last word.
Okay. In that case, then don't pass any laws because you might not enforce them. We have to do as well as we can for the next 2 years. But the idea that expanding a guest worker program is amnesty is just counterfactual. I do think people who served in the military, we ought to consider some pathway that they could become citizens, people who've served and put their lives on the line, which is a lot more than many Americans do who are born here. And that's not amnesty. That's
and we should point out that existing law allows non-citizens to serve in our military, and one of the fruits of that is citizenship. Again, Grover, to be polite about it, there are existing laws that, if they were enforced, would go a long way toward healing whatever rifts exist and actually taking care of the border. Look, I appreciate the fact we may have different opinions on that issue, but you've brought us a lot of insightful analysis on this budget battle. As always, Grover Norquist, we thank you for your time, and America's Forum will continue here on